Hello, everyone. Welcome you all to the fourth episode of Lumbung Calling, a discussion series part of Documenta 15 public program named Maidan. Due to the technical problems, we have a delay couple of minutes, but here we go again. Today, the Lumbung Calling focuses on generosity, and we are more than glad to host Yasmin Edit Sabah and Mahmoud Dafe, founder of Festival Surulai Niger. My name is Mirwan Andan, and I'm a member of Ruang Rupa, a collective based in Indonesia. As you might know, we have been invited to imagine and draft Documenta 15. Documenta 15 will be open on June 18, 2022, next year, but various initiatives have already been launched. Although some of you might be familiar with Lumbung Calling, as we already have had three episodes which were a local anchor, humor, and independence, but let me briefly explain further what this program consists of. Lumbung Calling is a collection of discussion and conversations with a variety of guests exploring Lumbung from a variety of contexts and perspective. And it will take place on first Saturday of every month from last April until October 2021. But what exactly do we mean by Lumbung? Lumbung can be defined as a container to store agricultural products, commonly rice, in the form of a house on stilts with walls of woven wood or bamboo. In Indonesia, it is quite common to see these buildings similar to a barn. However, lumbung goes beyond its physical presence. This term can indeed be used to describe shared collective resources. It can also be viewed as a collection of principles and a cosmology that describe daily life, common sharing, and community as a potential activity. Or it means that lumbung can be a software but also can be a hardware. Lumbung Calling, the name of this program, it is a call to our social attitudes, and it's intended to raise consciousness about the practice of lumbung or sharing. Each edition of the series is dedicated to one of lumbung values. The first focus on local anchor, where we investigated with our guests Melanie Budianta and Armin Salasa from Indonesia about the roots of sharing, the diversity in collaborative practices in various contexts, from the remote countryside to the hectic city life. The second Lumbung Calling was post attention on humor with guests Giritia Gawiwong and Surapadke, where we discuss how humor can trigger and expand our approach, especially in an artistic context. And then the third Lumbung Calling confers about independence on relation between humans and other than humans, with independence and interdependence together with guests Tanya Burgera and
in an
Omar
artistic
Tesdel.
context.
As you have witnessed our guests from a diversified panorama, academics, cultural leaders, independent scholar, organic producer, and festival organizer, we invite them to address challenges they faced and discuss with us how they implemented changes on different scale. I couldn't have wished for a more perfect co-host, the artist Jumana Emil Abud. Jumana Emil Abud's creative practices engage with oral histories, with personal and collective mythologies, drawing on the tradition of Palestinian folklore and its integrated practice with land and water, with the human and non-human. Jumana is currently pursuing a practice PhD at the Slade School of Fine Art, University College, London. I thank you all in advance for your attention, and I give a warm welcome to Jumana, who will introduce you further to today's Lumbung Calling on generosity. Please note that the conversation will last around 1 hour and a half via D15 YouTube chat and through D15 Facebook page. It is indeed possible to ask questions or give comments that will be selected and shared with our guests. Please note that this event will stay online afterwards with the addition of subtitles. Gimana?
Thank you, Andan. Thank you so much, everyone. It's such an honor to be here again for the fourth Lumbung Calling on generosity. So today's Lumbung Calling discussion focuses on the Lumbung value of generosity, as my dear friend Andan said, spanning material and emotional realms. Generosity, or the willingness to give, is vital in any ecosystem building processes. It also poses a firm challenge against competition, rivalry, and rarity, capitalist values that define contemporary life. In Lumbung, generosity in imagining possibilities based on networking and collaboration abounds. It recognizes that knowledge is diverse, that it cannot be owned or claimed. Time and attention are inexhaustible resources in Lumbung, and thus should be the attention, time and attention are inexhaustible resources in Lumbung, and thus should be generously shared in building more integrated ecosystems. In this edition, artist Yasmin Eid Sabbagh and social innovator and founder of Festival Sur le Niger, Mamou Daffé, discusses how giving is difficult to gauge. Eid Sabbagh addresses how making archives accessible can be a powerful act of philanthropy and information dissemination on the one hand, but it may also lead to many unexpected challenges on the other. Daffé discusses how important sharing is to Foundation Festival Sur le Niger, which is responsible for one of the most important cultural events in West Africa. The Festival Sur le Niger. In particular, he introduces Maya entrepreneurship, an integral concept of humanity concerning the relationship between the individual and the community. Yasmin Eid Sabbagh is an artist who explores potentials of human agency through engaging in experimental collective work processes in her practice. These include a collaboration with inhabitants of Burj al-Shamali, a Palestinian refugee camp near Tyr, Lebanon, and radical pedagogical projects such as Se Melane Crecier, a la Natura, sorry for my pronunciation, a self-organized forest kindergarten in Bonyula, Spain, using nature as a main infrastructure. In Eid Sabbagh's work, photography often acts as a medium to communally investigate notions of collectivity, power, and endurance. For example, in her engagement as a member of the Arab Image Foundation, a practitioners-led archival institution, and in her focus, PhD in art theory and cultural studies from the Academy of Fine Art in Vienna, which she obtained in 2018. Mamou Daffé is a social innovator and expert in art and cultural management. Daffé is part of a new generation of social leaders whose mission is to design projects and local operations with a strong economic, cultural, and social impact. In 2005, he founded the Festival Sur le Niger, an artistic project aimed at promoting cultural expression while simulating the local economy through art. Foundation Festival Sur le Niger is a Lumbung member of Documenta 15. Daffé is also the initiator of the innovative Maya entrepreneurship model, a social entrepreneurial model inspired by the humanist values of Mali, and will shortly be discussing these humanist values in our discussions. In 2011, he created the Center Cultural Corée. It's a sub-regional reference center for the development of art and culture, and the IKAM Training Institute for the Development of Art Professionals in Mali and elsewhere. After chairing the Pan-African Network of Cultural Actors, a territorial network from 2015 to 2017, he co-founded, together with the great artists and cultural actors of the continent, the first African Cultural Fund, ACF, in 2018, of which he became the first chairperson. Today, Mamou is joined by our dear colleague Taher Maïja, and they will be, in fact, speaking in their native language of Bambara. So welcome, dear Mamou and Taher. And I would very much like to actually start with you, if that's all right. If you can kindly let us know of how the Foundation Festival Sur le Niger was born, especially when thinking about generosity.
Oui, oui. Comment la fondation est née, notamment ce qui concerne la générosité.
Bon, Fondation Festival Sur le Niger, c'est où acteur de Djera, parce que Angadou mais Dibila. Et Anya yi c'est où seconde do yi c'est où du bay. Ko chamambe na ya do bala abseke sabu kan mi yile du no. Et puis en for la nyoronka, anya acteur be. Donc, pour que Amseka Dje, ka baraki nyoron fi chugumina, ka nyoron deme, pour que anga sigida ani anga sekondi dum se ka du bala chumna donc o nyoni no baro de na dondoni kana festival créé.
The Foundation Festival in Niger was created by actors from tourist and culture sector in Ségou because they noticed that Ségou was just a stopover to the region in the northern part of the country. And this is why these actors decided to gather to work together in order to have a cultural event that will show all the generosity and all the richness of the city of Ségou.
C'est-à-dire, Anjena, c'est pour que Ségou ne donne pas de parce que c'est une culture de art et culture Ségou est historique. Donc, la société de tradition valeur mononga, nous et Maya, nous valeur d'État en 2005, Kabarak me programme ce festival de l'élection.
So the festival was created on the basis of the Maya values because Ségou is a very cultural city with a richness in cultural diversity. So we decided to create this event based on the Maya values. Maya, which is has humanity at the beginning, one of the most important values in Malian society, which makes the relationship between the individual and the community. And this value of Maya calls for values like generosity, like respect for others, like sharing, like solidarity. So all these values make it possible for actors to get together and create this great event. And also in order to promote culture, arts and culture in Ségou. Because Ségou is an old city of culture and tradition, and it's the ancient capital city of the Bambara Kingdom with many cultural assets and many potentials in the touristic field. On peut enchaîner avec la générosité.
Ouais. Donc, générosité, Maya, on fait avec Damna Maya Josem Bilelbade. Donc, Maya Josem Bilelbade, Maya, nous avons des ski café, nous avons valeur chaman de be Maya. Donc, la valeur comment doit Maya, nous générosité. Donc, Maya, avec Damna famille forade là. Fa ani doute qui ont des garanties ou bien mon cas qu'on est au début moyen garantie famille kono a famille avec dame nani ñoron demain des cabinets fitini cellule de base mo be ñoron demain ambe ñoron soutenir en ko là donc ni demain yoro boy ambe na balmaya là parce que famille balmaya di ou des kama ika balma be yoro là avec ñoron demain c'est un code de douane ñoron tie pour que avec famille sur de base donc à partir de là on met à valeur tout là.
So talking about generosity in our context, one of the main points in generosity is Numaya. Numaya, which is the base of generosity, it's a fact of doing wellness to other people in the family and in the society. And the person in charge of this Numaya in the family is the father and the mother, the old persons. And the father and the mother are the stakeholders. And the family is based on this Numaya, this value of Numaya between the members of the family. And he also talked about one value, which is Balmaya, which is a kinship, which is also a very strong value between the members of the family in Malian society. And this notion of Balmaya calls for other values like solidarity and hospitality.
La famille serait bétadi, le bien commun. Il faut parler de ça. In
the family, the wealth is for everybody. It's a common wealth. It's not for only an individual.
Donc, améliorons demain, et donc, c'est un code, c'est une règle qui régit tous les membres de la famille avec Balma Paix.
So it's a rule that regulates all the members of the family. And it's based on this code.
Voilà. Et donc, ni bora famille codrona, il vient à société là.
And from the family, you go to the society.
Avec ces mêmes valeurs
with the same
de Balmaya.
with the same values of Balmaya.
Et donc, ni dans la société là, et valeur de Béko Jatria.
And when you arrive in society, there is a strong value called Jatria, which is hospitality.
Dans notre histoire, même voilà, c'est un des articles les plus forts que nous avons en Afrique.
In our history, even if you go back to the Kuru Kamfuga Charter in the Mande Empire, it is told that people coming from other horizons, you must treat it like you treat the family members, because they are like messengers coming from elsewhere. So you have to treat them and take care of them, sometimes even more than the family members. And after Jatigia, we have another strong value, which is Senanguya, which is a kinship relationship.
C'est-à-dire, c'est un code entre les différentes ethnies.
It's a code between different ethnic groups and families in Malian society.
C'est un mécanisme qui permettait de régler tout genre de conflits dans la société.
It's a mechanism between, as I said, between the different ethnic groups and family members that allows to settle conflicts in the society, because in Mali we have many different ethnic groups, but because of this notion of Jatigia, hospitality, Jatigia, kinship relationship with humor, because it's a relationship we do with humor between the members, we are able to fix many issues in the society.
Voilà, à travers cet humour-là, on peut faire régler l'humour-là de Jatigia, de Senanguya. C'est comme un serment. Comment on dit le serment?
So through these values of humor in Senanguya, we are able to fix many issues. It's like a sermon.
Dans notre tradition, anga mo de sikira ka kalinyoye ka fondi groupe ni famille groupe be kotonyontala.
In our tradition, the elders sit down and make an oath between themselves to say that between this family and this family, or this ethnic groups and the other ethnic groups, we have to listen to each other and accept what the other group says.
Et niota ça a bébé soro fil conducteur de la noué d'ambé.
And all these values are in the same, we can find all these values in what we call Dambe, which is like a global value.
La limite dans toute chose, d'avoir une limite dans toute chose.
Dambe is the restraint limit in whatever we are doing in society.
D'éviter les extrêmes.
And to avoid to go to the extremes.
Mais ni moyata en fait. C'est pas matériel seulement.
When you talk about Nyumaya in our society, it's not generally about material, about money.
No,
okay, generosity. Nyumaya is generosity. When you talk about generosity in our society, it's not always about just material or money.
C'est d'abord le langage.
It's the language.
It's et avec talike nous avec talike fin chamana ani anga signon fait anga benkulanga kutunyo tala ufuna imado.
Generosity also means sitting together in an area in the family and consent what the other says and accept what the other says.
Ani tolerance, ani pardon.
And also it talks about tolerance and forgiveness.
C'est pourquoi dans la tradition, dans la société, c'était très tolérant, c'était très paisible parce que au niveau de la générosité, valeur nous permettait d'accepter, le degré d'acceptation de l'autre, de tolérance des partenaires était très élevé. Donc, la société pouvait avoir équilibre. Il y avait un bon équilibre.
This is why the notion of generosity was very important in our society, because it calls for notions of tolerance and acceptance of others and sharing. Notre idée, c'est
ouais, ok, c'est bon. Donc maintenant, l'ITRA générosité là par rapport à un bara tableau là. Fondation Festival.
Talking about generosity in what we are doing within our organization, Foundation Festival sur le Niger.
En organisation, on a créé qu'à basé au Maya valeur numérique.
We created the organization based on this Maya values.
On a organisé comme une communauté, on vit comme une communauté.
So we organized ourselves as a community.
Et dans la communauté, on a des règles dans toutes choses. Nous partageons les peines, les joies, tout ensemble.
So in this community, we have rules. In whatever happens, like events, like good or bad events, we share these feelings together. In happy circumstances or bad circumstances, there is a kind of solidarity between the team members. So we live together like a community.
Donc, si quelqu'un est membre de la communauté a une situation ou un problème, on peut dire qu'on a à demain. Moralement, ce n'est pas seulement l'argent. Ça veut dire que chaque membre que nous créons se sent très fort de la force des autres.
So if a member of the organization has a problem, all the other members of the organization come and help this person, not only financially, but morally sometimes. So every member feels strong by the strength of all the team.
Donc, nous avons oui, sera là et ni nous fana bikaso par exemple que ce soit Dengundi, que ce soit Hera mariage amiti ko fana peke ñoko fe.
So when you take for example the naming ceremonies or the wedding ceremonies in our families, all the members gather to do it together. So all these are kind of generosity within our organization.
Sans compter qu'on a, comme Lumbungu Bejukomina, on a aussi un pot commun, un fonds commun de solidarité qui est là pour tout le monde.
Like in the Lumbung concept, we also have a common pot of solidarity to help all the members of the community, of the organizations when needed.
Et à générosité, jusqu'à ce que membres Chamambé, par exemple, Amandou Tokodanyona, pour dire que Kayiraka faut aller cligner.
So this generosity goes beyond all this, because even within the organization, some members of the staff can give their name to other members of the staff in order to make this communion between the members. In order to unify the organizations and to be one.
I think that's such a beautiful word, actually, to unify. And there's there's so much in that I visualize, and I think that all of us, our speakers and our listeners, can visualize when we imagine what does it mean to unify, and how generosity plays such a significant role. It's been amazing to hear about the foundation's birth and continuing practice. And I want to come back to this and ask you a couple of questions. I'm sure Andan also has some questions for you. But right now, temporarily, I would like to actually introduce Yasmin as well. And with you, Mamu and Tahir, we've been talking about the generosity of being and how much there's so much involved in community practice. And with Yasmin, I'm very much interested to hear about how in your own artistic practice, you're working a lot with archives. And how does working within the archive, how does it play in terms of generous practices? And especially because on the one hand, you're working with, let's say, the dead or the past, and on the other hand, you're trying to bring them back to life. Do you know what I mean by this question?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jumana. And thank you, all of you, for having us today. I'm really pleased to have this conversation with you, even though it's still a mystery for me why I was invited to speak about generosity, which I think is not an easy task. But to answer your question about archives, I guess maybe what one needs to set as a starting point is that archives were mainly created in order to narrate a certain history, you know, and there is always a question of power involved. So it's, at least in history, the powerful who were collecting and bringing together materials to create a certain evidence of a narration they were interested of telling. And it's in recent times, and when I say recent times, I'm saying in the past 30 years, let's say, that there's more and more initiatives of collecting and archiving that try to give a certain visibility to less heard stories, histories, her stories, etc. But the question is always, what happens once a group or an institution has decided to archive material? What are they doing with this? Are they simply possessing it and keeping it and kind of even capitalizing on it? Or is there a politics inside of an archive that is more generous and that really proposes to put the material gathered and the work done at the disposal of everyone in order to reread this material, to try to understand it, to generate more knowledge around these materials, and really have an open conversation about them. And so one example I can give is the Arab Image Foundation, with which I've been involved for several years now. That is an archive that was compiled and gathered by a group of artists over time. And in the beginning, material was collected and selected by the persons who were kind of part of the initiative. And after 5, 6, 7 years, people, because they knew about the foundation, would also approach it and donate materials to the foundation. Well, at the internal of this organization, we have had lots of discussions of how to make images accessible to everyone. And so one question is always technology, but the other question is also really, let's say, more political decisions. Like, do you give access to everyone to all the material? Because then there is communities we work with, like in my case in Bujishmeli, where the political context of this community is so delicate that actually the community itself, when we were working on gathering a digital repository with the community, when contributing images to this depository, they were saying that they were not interested in these images being accessible globally by anyone from anywhere. And here is where there is a limit to this generosity, because I think it is not only about generosity, because it is also about preserving the privacy and respecting this very specific context people live in. And here probably these images that were gathered and digitized have a different agency, which is not directly connected to generosity, but that have another mission first.
Have you had any, let's say, challenges when you say that it's not always easy to gauge the generosity because you're working with communities that may not, there's something almost probing into an intimacy with archives. And so how do you work within the challenges?
Yeah, I guess this question of generosity is easy to discuss when one lives in a situation that allows for generosity, in the sense where we are in control, where there is enough means actually to be generous. And then, of course, we can always say, probably, well, generosity is always possible and should always be possible, no? But I mean, without wanting to be moralist, I mean, in the case of, for example, the work we have been doing in Bujishmeli, we would also get to moments where, I guess, if we try to think of the work under the perspective of generosity, one needs to juxtapose questions of exhaustion next to generosity. I think one can be extremely generous with time, with the way one works, etc. But when it is in a context where one is already not in control and where the political, economic, and social kind of context is already really hard on everyone, there is a moment when the generosity on top of this comes from those who live this difficult situation. It is just too much that is asked for. And I guess this is where the greater imbalance comes into play, you know, that one actually often has a difficulty to act upon. So with generosity, we can act in our, let's say, smaller or a greater community locally, but then there is these bigger actors that create these disbalances that lead to exhaustion, despair, etc.
And Dan, did you like to ask any questions? So, or I can also.
Yeah. After listening to Mamu and Yasmin explanation of the notion of generosity, maybe I will go first to Mamu and Atahir. Is it the term and the concept that you mentioned? It's also applied in is it only in Mali or in some places in Africa? Or let's say like the neighbor countries of Mali. Yeah.
C'est à peu près Afrique de l'Ouest de l'Ouest en fait. Parce que dans l'histoire, toute l'Afrique de l'Ouest était un même territoire. Donc c'est plus ou moins ça. Mais quand tu regardes l'Afrique de la Kenya, jusqu'en Afrique du Sud par exemple, tu sais que tu vas trouver à valeur colonie. Par exemple, l'Itra Sud-Afrique, l'Outaïmbe. Donc oui, il y a des concepts similaires dans toute l'Afrique et c'était des valeurs traditionnelles.
It's generally in West Africa, but you can find this kind of concept in every part of Africa, because when you take in the times of empires, we have many countries in the same empire, and these values of Maya have similar values in other parts of Africa. Like in South Africa, you have Ubuntu and similar values like that. In Uganda, you have other values. But this value of Maya, you can find it in many West African countries.
Les familles pouvaient fonctionner dans la cellule de base de la famille. Et puis même les contrées, les royaumes étaient fédérés avec cette règle et ces principes de Maya, de générosité.
Because even the family was ruled with this concept of generosity, and even in the kingdoms, the way the king rules his empire was refers to this notion of generosity in general.
On fédérait les communautés et les royaumes à travers la notion de fédération est présente.
So the notion of unifying communities was able through this concept of generosity in our traditional societies.
C'est un pilier fort.
So it's a very strong pillar, a very strong element in our society, generosity.
Yeah, in Indonesian context, it's always that sometimes that generosity is always, we always see a mother, it's like a son. There is a song that we were raised and we've been listening since when we were child. Hanya memberi tak harap kembali, or only to give and never hope in return. So it's a metaphor to a mother is like a son. So son never asking anything in return. So it's also, is there any metaphor like this in your context that generosity is like a son, it's like a mother? Yeah.
Dans le concept, il y a une notion de générosité où On dit que la maman est comme le soleil. Voilà.
Exactement. En vrai, la tradition, c'est un peu ça. C'est-à-dire que chez nous, c'est le maman, c'est le papa. Fa bébé est soleillé. Après, on réguler autour de l'eau. C'est pourquoi j'ai parlé de fédération. Et c'était la règle et le principe. C'est-à-dire que Ambé Fenglende et Ambé Kangana Fenglende soutenu. C'est comme les atomes qui tournent autour du soleil, les rayons qui tournent autour du soleil, quoi. Hein? Et tu as fait oui, il faut traduire ça. En fait, c'est la même chose. C'est-à-dire qu'avec comme il fait des soleils, bébé tourne autour de là, allez, bébé, c'est une garantie.
So in our context, it's rather the father with like the son who unifies all the members of the family around himself.
Il garantit pour tout le monde.
And guarantees wellness and well-being for everybody.
Voilà. Et il garantit la générosité aussi.
And he also guarantees the concept of generosity in the family.
Donc ça avec équilibre de façon de dire.
So it gives a kind of balance in the family.
Harmonie
and there is harmony and acceptance between the different members of the family.
Mais il y a un royaume par exemple le royaume Bambara de Ségou. Et Fama était très généreux. Le roi,
even if you take the example of our kingdoms, like the example of the Bambara kingdom, the king was very generous.
Mais Yasmine Ekmanofo, il a parlé des limites. C'est vrai qu'aujourd'hui, on aurait fait limite Chamambe Maïna.
Yasmin talked about the limits of generosity, and it's true that even in our context, there are many limits in generosity.
Now.
Et
les limites, c'est ça. On fait cellule de base, c'est la famille.
In our context, the core base is the family.
C'est la cellule de base dedans, cellule de base. C'est-à-dire, c'est l'unité de base.
It's a basic unit
for la société.
For society.
Donc, donc ça fait que transmission de Jora. Si ça transmission parce que nous sommes de la bonne famille éclatera.
Now, one of the limits of generosity is that the notion of transmission has been broken, because when you take the families are no more like in the ancient configuration, because now with modernization we have families where the father and the mother lives apart.
Il y a des
wives are sometimes alone with the children, and sometimes fathers are alone with the children.
Donc la transmission de cette valeur-là.
So when the family lives in this way, the transmission, there is many difficulties in terms of transmitting the message and the generosity.
Ni flananta oisivité, parce que faut le faire, règlement de paix qu'on va respecter. Donc ça fait que belle comme l'année doye, mais si ça, do ya que te barake, donc mon bis ça va, mon kelemulu ta en charge. Donc ça fait que moi c'est qu'à continuer.
So the second one is the feeling of idleness, because of in the ancient system, everybody have to contribute to the development of the family, of the society. But now, one person is in charge of many other persons, and this gives a kind of idleness and a kind of dependence. So dependence is also a limit for.
Donc ça fait que moi c'est maintenant dans le cadre de la société, tu fais toujours attention parce que voilà.
This is why now the doing generosity is very hard. So you have to take.
Parce qu'il y a certains qui profitent de ça pour ne pas jouer leur rôle.
So because there are many people who take profit from this generosity, not to play their role in society.
Ça c'est. Mais la troisième chose aussi, c'est que si ça fait un matériel, or now
so the third thing is that now everything is based around material money, yes.
Donc or moyen bête monnaie
But generosity is not only material or money.
Parce que ari comportement humain dans la société, dans la famille,
Even behaving well in society is also a kind of generosity.
comme humain que tu peux être gentil de plusieurs façons qu'à se revoir tibolo.
You can do generosity in many other ways without material and money.
Ola valeur de fanabe ko horonya,
And there's also another value called horonya.
c'est-à-dire que iga kewale horonya kewale bato dia, c'est une forme d'être généreux avec les gens aussi parce que avec loyauté nati équipe là abu dañona oui valeur badoye en la fondation Konana parce que les membres sont très loyaux, sont horon, il y a les gens sont horon dans l'équipe.
It's called for notions like loyalty and dignity in the organization and society. This value of horonya make it possible in the organization to fidelize all the members of the society so they can be loyal to the organization.
I mean, it's fun. I'm sorry. Can I just jump in? There's so many ideas. I mean, it's amazing to hear you speaking about the values. There are so many values, and it's so relevant within the generosity Lumbung topic. But I think in the meantime, I have so many questions. So is it all right if I just jump in to say one of the ideas that you discussed earlier, Mamu, about the limits of generosity and the idleness and the how there seems to be more of a tendency to look at monetary values now. But in a way, what you have been doing with the festival Sur la Niger has been extraordinary in terms of how much you have impacted on your immediate culture. Because I mean, I know that you have at least provided over 1,000 jobs through this festival, with over 30,000 visitors, and you're also the participation of the community isn't just a human participation. You're also, I mean, it's inviting the participation of the territory, the property. So when we were talking about generosity with Yasmin, we slightly talked about the issue of the property of the archives. And with you, there is the property, maybe even of the river itself, because does the festival happen along the river? How do you involve nature and the river itself? And from this question, I really would like also to link with Yasmin's practice in connection to property and in connection to nature and in connection to time. So I realize that there is these so perhaps there could be a discussion as well that can be opened up. So I think the first question I had was, how do you involve nature as a significant generous component, and in terms of property? And then we can also please link it to Yasmin's artistic practice with time.
So should I start, or Mahmoud? Yeah, okay. No, I mean, the question of nature, I think, is interesting. And as Mamu and Atahir was speaking, I was actually thinking of this kind of complex situation that would allow to try to understand individual generosity versus collective generosity, or the position of an individual in a collective. And then here we, of course, have like the smaller or immediate collective, and then the bigger ones the smaller collective connects to. And I guess what is important is to understand that this kind of concept or embodiment of generosity is possible in these very complex networks, and that they cannot be looked at like at a very individual level. Like if we believe in generosity, we probably all have to contribute to this much bigger kind of embodiment of this concept. And when thinking of individual versus collective generosity, I was actually thinking about education, no? Like, how do you decide how much the generosity actually should favor and accompany the individual development of each child? I mean, in my case, I'm speaking about early childhood education rather than later education, where I think here an immense generosity is necessary to let each individual child be accompanied and develop its own interests, curiosities, emotions, etc., in order to become a full and a confident person. And actually, my experience draws from a project that we initiated with a group of parents in Spain, where children evolve the entire morning in nature and are accompanied by 2 facilitators, which actually don't educate them, but accompany them with actually an enormous generosity, because their main work is to work on themselves, the adults, in order not to project their own fears, their own complexes, whatever, on the children while intervening with the children. So the work is done on the adults in order to be able to accompany these children and favor their development that comes, let's say, from their inside, no, without imposing or kind of trying to educate them to a specific value. But of course, the values like generosity and many others are, of course, important in this context, because this is the way how children are accompanied then. And here nature plays actually an important role, because the idea in this accompaniment, in this emotional accompaniment in early childhood in nature, is that nature is generous, actually. If you have a small child and you have it in a room with whatever floor and walls, and it's just sitting there, nothing would happen. You would need an adult to animate, let's say, the child or occupy it, no? But in nature, the child sits there and thousands of things happen. And an ant passes by. One day there's a flower, the next there's 2 or 3. And so there is a stimulus that is constant and that is extremely generous, and that allows for actually this development and learning that is inherent to the children's kind of drive and natural kind of development. So here I would say, like, the generous kind of actor in this type of education is nature.
Amazing. And so, Mamu, how do you, how do you invite the river, speaking of nature and its generosity?
Ni anga sigidata lien ba de be nature ni générosité ni moyache, parce que avec tali que folo fait en fait en la tradition na mo ko be do jari ke chasse de ke ko be dim sunu kala ni sugo kono mo na be takama chuko mina dim sunu be kalola dim sunu be kana sugo ka production gatila. C'était comme des tabous. Donc, il y avait tout un règle qu'on enseignait aux enfants. Comme ça, c'était une forme de générosité envers les animaux. Envers les, voilà.
So there is a strong link between the generosity and the nature in our context. Because when you take our society, we have the traditional hunters called Donso. And in the Donso society, they taught young children at the basic age how to protect environment. They are shown and instructed on how to recognize an animal which is pregnant, the period when the animal is pregnant, and during this period, nobody has the right to kill this animal. So this is a very important fact, and these values were taught to children since their childhood.
Et par exemple, mardo be ko c'est-à-dire que na niveau de sorte, par exemple, éléphant bena minikala dans le mon niveau soro éléphant tena minikala. Donc comme demsonu kala ni à ce niveau là, on faisait attention à l'eau pour ne pas gaspiller l'eau, pour que le niveau puisse atteindre le niveau des éléphants.
And also in the case of the ponds, the level of water in the ponds, in society, the children were also taught, because when the level of the pond, of the water reached a certain level, elephants and other animals came to drink water in the pond. So people were taught to be careful in order to get this level of water on the pond, so that animals can come and drink water. So this also is a kind of generosity linked with nature.
Il y a aussi la température de l'eau pour les poissons, parce que s'il y a une température de façon de fana. Donc, nous dit température de l'eau là, et encore fanda là. Donc, ces périodes-là, on les protège un peu.
There is also in the temperature of water. When the water has a certain temperature, it means that fishes are procreating in the water. So in this period, everybody is forbidden to fish. So this is also another kind of generosity in our society, and according to nature and animals. And children are taught all these values since the basic age.
Et à la fin, il y avait le bois sacré aussi chez nous. Le bois sacré, c'est que on disait, par exemple, pour protéger, pour créer des forêts classées, par exemple, on disait que c'est dans cet endroit, c'est le bois sacré où il y a les génies, il y a beaucoup de choses, donc personne ne doit entrer. Mais en fait, c'était pour permettre la flore et la faune de se développer, parce qu'il y avait même des interdits. Si jamais tu rentrais pour couper le bois ou pour couper, tu allais avoir des sanctions. Donc, c'est comme ça qu'on faisait que la nature était protégée.
So there were also areas we call the sacred wood, or bois sacré in French. And this area were protected because elder used to say that if you enter in these areas and cut trees, you can have many bad things in your life, and you can even meet with evil people who will have many sanctions for you. So all these mechanisms were set up in order to protect nature and animals in our society.
La plus précise, c'est-à-dire que l'armée, les forêts classées, on permettait d'avoir des forêts classées, de protéger
and it allows to have very selected areas where environment is protected.
That's amazing. That's really amazing to hear. And I want to go back as well to what was mentioned by Yasmin earlier about the difference between the individual versus the collective. And from what I understand with the practice of the foundation is that it's very much, there's something within that's cultural, something that's almost silently understood among the Mayan culture, that this is something which is what is practiced, isn't really written down. It's very oral. And this gets me also to thinking about the whole question of actually of visibility and how do we communicate a certain practice or a certain value, such as generosity. And in your case, Yasmin, maybe if you can also talk to us a little bit about the visibility of your practice. You know, how can artwork be communicated? And maybe in a way it almost links it with an earlier thought I had when I was hearing you speak about storytelling through archives and the generosity of storytelling.
That's an interesting question, Jumana. I guess actually as you're asking it, I have the impression that the connection of visibility has very much to do also with the generosity of time. I guess we live in a world in which everything is so accelerated and things go fast. And to actually take the time and accelerate is a gesture, I think, today very necessary. And here is where I would again do the connection with nature, where I think nature is very generous in an educational context, because it has a completely different kind of speed. It has nothing to do with the cities and the context we generally live in, where everything has a schedule. Like even in kindergartens, like kids arrive, then they do this, then they do that. And it's all about activities and starting and finishing. But this group of children that evolves in nature, they go with the rhythm of nature. And this is like really, I think, where something nearly magic happens actually, and where the histories that Mamou has been mentioning also emerge and unfold, no? That there is all these creatures living in a forest, and that there's all these imaginary worlds that are so necessary, but that were simply discarded in the world we live in today, no? Mm-hmm. And so to come back to questions of visibility, I think that, for example, with images, or the reflection I've been working a lot with, not only on my own, but also with the collectives I've been working with, is that today we consume images at a pace that is like actually where we ourselves have difficulties to digest all that we see, you know? And so that the question has always been that we need to think and reflect again of how we encounter images and how we look at them and how we propose to disseminate them and how their dissemination or making them visible or actually retaining them from being accessible, visible, says something about how we want to engage with them, you know? And in specifically in the project that I've been working on for a long time in Bujishmali, the digital depository created with the community from Bujishmali that I've mentioned before, we got really to the conclusion that not necessarily making the images accessible visually was a way to engage with them with a different pace and encountering them in a different way in order to actually not only access their visual content, but somehow access this complex construct of political, economic, social reality that connects to them and that also shapes them and shapes the encounter with them today. And this is why finally, I think often, but not always at all, it's not about making visible or, you know, keeping away from the eyes the photographs, but it's about all what happens in between. And I guess this is where time again is so important, no? And narration, because in this kind of space between visibility and invisibility, so many things can happen, and it's about this how, you know, what happens there and how can we engage with the materialization that might be embodied, that might be oral, that might be performative, that might be whatever it might be, that allows us to engage with a material that maybe to start with when we encounter it is visual, but that we just don't decide not to reproduce visually in that way.
Yeah, but sometimes as well, when we're speaking about nature, I mean, I think nature can be an amazing collaborator, but at the same time, it also has its limits, especially as we've seen in the last year and a half with Corona, for example, and its limitations. So how can we then function, let's say, in a situation such as a festival, for example? You know, what could be then the limits that are imposed by the uncontrollable power of nature?
Le caractère incontournable de la nature. Les limites par rapport à ça, c'est-à-dire oui, pour un festival, par exemple, quand on a un festival Baradamna, pour discuter des fonctions multiples du fleuve. C'était pour savoir, par exemple, les stages même du festival, c'est sur le fleuve. Bon, donc on voulait contribuer pour l'ensablement, parce qu'il y a un problème d'assablement chez nous, parce que les gens vont prendre donc il y avait beaucoup de limites comme ça par rapport à l'environnement. Donc il a fallu qu'on mesure un peu le niveau de l'eau et puis qu'on essaie d'aider Cameroun pour que Yamsega dit fleuve protégé parce que ça pouvait être un frein à la nature, parce que en festival on est engagé développement durable de l'eau. Ça veut dire que environnement belakana. Bon, or environnement duna fleuve bekajiki donné. Donc agno kuzu là, je sais pas si tu peux avec ça.
In our context with the festival, as you know, the festival takes place on the borders of the Niger River. Mm-hmm. So since the beginning, we discussed with stakeholders of the river in order to protect this river, because there is a sand production, because many people take sand from this river, and that this was a very big threat to the protection of the river. So we discussed with all the stakeholders so that they can stop these practices in order to protect their river and to protect the environment at the same time. Because in the same way we set up an observatory of the Niger River,
Oui, le forum sur la fonction multiple du fleuve qui a abouti à la création de l'observatoire.
We had first a forum for where we discussed about the multiple functions of the Niger River, and from this forum we created the observatory of the Niger River in order to protect the river with all the communities around this.
Et tout ceci a amené la communauté de Meka impliquée dans la préservation de la nature.
And all these help the community to involve much more in the protection of nature.
Donc c'était une forme de générosité.
It was a kind of generosity also
par rapport à la communauté,
in relation with the community
et la nature.
And nature also.
Et maintenant, depuis, ils prennent le sable jusqu'au milieu du fleuve qui a permis maintenant que le bateau peut circuler pendant toutes les périodes de l'année.
And now they take the sand in the middle of the river, but not at the borders. And this makes it easier for the boats, the canoe to
continue
to circulate easily.
Can I maybe say something? Jumana, I'm wondering, and I mean, it's interesting what you are mentioning, Mamou, because you have been speaking about, you know, what is happening now, but I think these types of things happen because of human intervention in nature, no? I mean, there is research done on, for example, how the AIDS virus, went from the apes to the human. And it's actually as a moment when in Belgian Congo, they changed the flow of a river, by kind of, because of extraction and industrial or implementation and economic exchanges and access of ships, etc. And so this was the moment when there was a human intervention into nature that kind of, these kind of natural cycles went out of their initial process and intervened in what today, I mean, we see as a kind of, how do you say, danger to our way of living, But this, I think, is also where there is this difference when you speak about nature and the effect it has on children, because children naturally probably have a certain respect towards what they encounter. And once we're getting older and adults, actually this kind of balance is broken, because today humans just interact on or act on nature in the way they are interested in. Actually, there is seldom a generosity towards nature, as Mamou was just describing it, I mean, one would be more used to hear about a festival that uses the river, and the river, because of the festival, gets more dirty. So what we're hearing from him is the opposite, that as they were using or working by the river, they were improving interaction with the river. But I don't think this is like, I mean, here is where the question is, who acts generously on whom? Nature on the human on nature, or not, no?
Yes, I think when we're discussing specifically the issue of generosity, and especially with hearing Mamou and Taher speak about all the values that is within their ecosystem. So, it makes me, I think very much, I agree with you, Yasmin, that the value of generosity cannot or should not only be practiced within human to human. It really does need to be, it does need to engage non-human, it needs to engage children, it needs to engage ancestry, it needs to engage nature on all levels of generosity.
Yeah, and also I remember during our first Lumbung Calling local anchor, when we invited Armin Salasa, an activist and also an organic farming practitioner. He and his group in Bulukumba, South Sulawesi, have been practicing this for more than 10 years, and where he mentioned that plants as part of the nature are the most strongest creature, but also at the same time they are the most submissive one. So even though they are the strongest, but whatever we want to do to them, they're very submissive. So maybe this is also part of the thing that Yasmin mentioned before, that nature is one of the most important thing in the notion of generosity.
And probably just to add to what you're saying, Andan, is what Mamou has mentioned in the very beginning, is that generosity alone actually cannot function, and that in the Mayan culture, it's linked to so many other kind of concepts of respect and many other, and that once one leaves one of these values out, the others are not functioning anymore, because it creates an imbalance, in this very complex construct that would allow, to really build on solidarity, respect, generosity, that are all linked to each other. No, Mamou?
C'est ça, Oredo.
Yes, it is. Commentaire ou bien.
Ouais. Non, c'est ça, c'est la générosité, c'est pas. Abe Maya valeur de kono, bebe tali ke nyokona ko. Nyokon deme, nyokon bonya, koto nyokon tala, sananguya, jatigia, bon, on peut à dissocier quoi. On peut tali ke nyokona, mais c'est valeur de base de l'eau, et que ari de la timambe c'est ça. Anga sigida la ani guerre kono, c'est parce que générosité valeur de pesera, parce que dans les pesera. So
generosity is a value, and there is a relationship between generosity and other Maya values in general, and it's called so many aspects like sharing, like solidarity, and what we are experiencing now with the many crises and issues in our society, it's because the level of generosity has go down. And when the level of generosity goes down, it creates a lot of problems in the society. And at the same time, many values go down with generosity, because the values are very closely linked.
He
wanted to also add something about generosity concerning time.
Il y a même un adage qui dit au nord, en Europe, ils ont la montre, en Suisse, mais ici, nous, on a le temps.
When you take our society, there is even something that said that in the Western countries, they have the watch, but here in Africa, we have time.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about that, actually? And when we're talking about time, it's also linking with what Yasmin said earlier as well, with the question of time and the past and ancestry.
Oui, bon, il y a les ancêtres aussi. Mais par rapport au temps, par exemple, ne ka bureau là ça. Et ne cousin de petit nganati rendez-vous ta là. Abi sigi parce que problème de voilà ou bien faire le bac foyer. Abi sigi avec temps ngara bata. C'est pas que la société est minutée en timing la journée, tu dois faire ça à tel point. C'est très difficile. Ici le temps c'est vraiment extensif et des gens sont d'une générosité. Et avec le temps, c'est extrêmement. C'est vrai que c'est extrême, c'est un peu exagéré, ça crée aussi des difficultés, mais c'est une forme de générosité à la base. C'est pour dire que j'ai du respect pour toi, je te donne plus de temps.
So the notion of time is very important, because when you take in our context, a close parent from you can come to your office and take a lot of your time, but you won't see these situations in other contexts. And because it's also a kind of generosity that also can have its limits. But in our context, if someone come and visit you, you have to grant him all the time necessary to show that you have many consideration for him. But it also has some limits in actually.
Non, pas seulement la limite, mais ça dit que c'est vraiment c'est vraiment important. Et il va expliquer parce que différence bas de yani ou parce qu'il y a un métal sur le il bɛ se ka disposer ni mɔgɔ ka temps ye cogo min na i mana planifier cogo cogo ni ko dɔ nana wajibi i bɛ temps d'o ma donc ça veut dire que an ka vie cogo yɛrɛ ɲɔgɔn fɛ nous oblige à être généreux avec le temps donc on n'a pas la même approche.
So even our way of living, let us be generous with time. We don't have the same approach like in the Western countries where everything is done in a certain kind of timing. But in our context, we have to be very generous with time.
Le temps est élastique.
And the time is very
élastique,
extensible.
C'est un peu ça. Mais il a parlé de l'autre point,
les ancêtres.
Les ancêtres. Oui. En Afro-Moro, il y a des termes. Et en ancêtres, générosité base de parce qu'en fait, dans la tradition, ancêtres B, ancêtres quoi est ancêtres bana ou ba suit ou ba de menanu wele ni kamana gana ou bien FMB selon que tu te comportes avec dignité bien ils sont généreux avec toi c'est quand même qui on refait fin chama ben ko mon chama bansoron avec dépôt la possible la générosité là.
So the generosity of ancestors is also a reality in our context because from where they are, we think that they are following us and they have a close view on whatever we are doing. So depending on your behavior in society, if you are behaving well or bad, whenever you call for the generosity and for the help, they always assist you from where they are. So the notion of ancestor is very important also in our context.
And so,
yes, Jumana.
Sorry, Mamu. Thank you, Tahir. I think that it's. I mean, if I can just also link it quickly with Yasmin, because she's working with photographs, right? Yasmin, you're working with photographs, archives, and it's another form of, let's say, I don't want to say ancestry, but there's something which is connected with the past. And how do you storytell? You know, how do you, where do you start when you're looking at photographs of someone from a specific time and another place? Shall I ask the question again?
Yes, please. There's lots of things happening here around me.
Yeah, I think it's great. So I think that if I can just try to be as simple as possible in the question, I want to go back to the idea of storytelling through the archival photograph. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, what I can maybe say concerning that is that in the context of Bujishmali specifically, I learned, actually, I completely changed my understanding of photography, actually. And I would say this is due to the way how people shared actually very generously and honestly their relation to photography with me. And it is when we would encounter together photographs that they chose to share with me or with others. Sometimes we were like 3, 4, 5 sitting around photographs, that I understood actually that the photographs are not only the material paper, let's say, or support, whatever it might be, and then the different layers that compose the image, but that each photograph holds many other narrative layers that I would say not only narrative, but even I would call them disembodied layers, no? But that can be simply silence, refusal, different types of trauma, but that could materialize through narration. And I think this is what I became specifically interested in when working with the community in Bujishmali, because they were really holding on to these invisible, disembodied layers very much when we were encountering the photographs. And so for me, it became evident that the essence of this work was not only about digitizing material documents, but was trying to capture actually this multi-dimensional layers of images, relation to images, and practices around images. And so this digital depository that we finally created in Bourges-Schmally and which we have addressed before, which is not a visual archive that is accessible anywhere, but that is a depository that actually holds as much sound files, as video files, as image files, but with all these stories or narratives all together. And that's the difficulty of this depository, I would say, because it is always a challenge to find ways how to rematerialize them in context in which we want to disseminate them or share them, no? And this is a little bit always the questions that we are still dealing with today. And so there is these moments of manifestation or materialization, but that constantly change and can be reinvented and re-embodied, and that are also always connected to a political situation that actually influences and impacts the way of what one makes accessible and how.
In this way, do you think then that you have to be generous because your narration of the photograph and your kind of imagination of it does need to bring in facts, obviously, but it has to go beyond the fact as well?
Well, it's not only that it needs, one needs to be generous in the sense of that it needs a lot of time, it needs a lot of energy too, and this is also why I've been speaking about exhaustion before. You know, one of the problems of this project is definitely that we have gathered this material, but that people have entrusted me with the material, no, and that today a lot of this digital depository is kind of linked to my person, which is a problem because it is meant to, I mean, it always was a collective effort and we continue to be collectively involved with this kind of effort. But still, as so many different, let's say, individual entities have connected to me and that the collective has built around that, there is something that, let's say, I wouldn't do again in the same way if I would have like thought of it from the beginning, no? And in that sense, this is where probably what you see as generosity comes in, is that, yes, there is a certain endurance needed to deal with this because this depository today exists and it is necessary that it exists. But we still constantly have to negotiate its existence, actually, because it doesn't have a fixed form. It's as if it is fluid. In order to embody it in different ways, we need to be present and to reinvent these formats. And yeah, this is where the generosity hits the exhaustion.
Thank you. That's really amazing to hear, actually.
And sorry, my daughters are playing and fighting. So
we are very generous.
Yeah,
we are generous.
Fine, that's totally fine.
Nobody's torturing them. It's all good.
We're generous listeners.
Yeah. Yasmin, and also this is a question from me, that how to be generous but loyal to the image at the same time. Yeah. And yeah.
You are all waking up now, no, coming with the difficult questions at the end. How to be generous and loyal to the image in the same time? Yeah, I mean, I think it's always a tension. There is a tension, and for me, at moments, it was not anymore about. I mean, I tell you, generosity is something I discussed today with you. It's not something that has been present in my mind all the time when I have been working, let's say. I guess, yes, the way how I position myself in the world, in my practice, with the communities I work with is probably one that may allow to think about generosity, but it's not something that I've been consciously thinking about. But I guess when you asked this question, I noticed that what this tension is there. And for me, it has been more important to make the tension visible rather than kind of deciding on the loyalty towards the image or the question of generosity, for example, towards a community. And this is why it's all about a negotiation process and making these tensions actually visible, but not necessarily for that the image itself visible, no, but rather make the problematic or the conflict that it holds visible.
Yeah, so I mean, generosity then is not, and I think that we can also see that from hearing Mamou and Tahir, that in general, the practice of both individual or collective work generosity is not something that is always good, all kindness. There is a negotiation, as Yasmin said, and you know, with you, Mamou, do you find that negotiation for generosity and generous acts is, you know, do you find yourself kind of hitting a wall with that? Is it something that's difficult for you to negotiate with, let's say, newcomers or people that maybe are not within the culture, to someone like as an outsider? We can say, you know, just in a few more words, because I'm aware also of the time
Can you please repeat it simply, please?
Yes, of course. I'm sorry for that. I think it's just my overexcitement because I'm suddenly aware of the time and I feel, okay, I have to be very simple. You're right. And I think that the question could be simplified by saying that negotiation of generosity. So when we speak of generosity, it's not necessarily something which is always good. And, you know, generosity is good, but there is a negotiation towards that process. So how do we negotiate generous acts?
Dans notre tradition chez nous, c'est pas une négociation la générosité, c'est un principe.
In our tradition, it's not a process of negotiation, but it's a principle.
De comment ça régule notre façon de vivre ensemble.
It regulates the way we live together.
C'est une partie de nous normalement.
Generosity is part of ourselves.
Normalement. Mais maintenant ça a changé.
But now it's changing.
Donc parce que c'est des codes.
Because it's about codes
qu'on appelle code Maya.
That are called the Maya codes.
Donc, mais maintenant, c'est avec l'évolution. Maintenant, bon, les gens peuvent négocier et ça peut être apprécié, mais la générosité, Maya, c'est événique au terme. C'est-à-dire que il y a hacké mié, il peut se faire minke, il faut le faire. C'est-à-dire absolument qu'il y a cadre de donc négociation théo, mais c'est une question. Selon ce que tu as acquis.
So generosity is not a matter of negotiation, but what you have to do and what you have to receive, and it's a principle that everybody knows in society normally.
Voilà, parce que
because there are some people who have more resources than others, and more knowledge also than others.
Voilà. Donc c'est pourquoi même à la base,
this is why the level of generosity are not the same. So you give depending on what you have, what your resources, the level of your resources.
Mais par contre, normalement, tu n'es pas à l'aise avec ça.
So what you have to do, if you don't do it in society, you don't feel at ease with your behavior in society.
Yes, but then there is also a question of responsibility too, right?
Yeah, voilà,
with the Yasmin's case, she's as an artist, she's having to negotiate the archival image and its story and its narration, and she has that in a way responsibility, and it's a kind of a right. So I
responsibility. That's the only way.
So responsibility is really the word. You have to be responsible.
I mean, it's very interesting. How do we negotiate within artistic practice when we're talking about as artists and through festivals? So I think it's been amazing to hear both of you speak today about the various experiences that you've had, and as well as Yasmin has had in working with people, with time, with nature, with archive, and with future as well. It's the generosity of our future, what we're doing now.
Oh, where are you?
That's it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your generosity on this Saturday, and then you still have time to converse with us in Lumbung Calling. Thank you so much, Yasmin, and also Mamudafe, and also At-Tahir Maiga, who's been translating from Bambara to English, and also to our audience who's following this program via YouTube Live and also lumbung.space and also via Facebook. I hope you have enjoyed today's conversation. And also would like to thank Yasmin and also Mamu and At-Tahir Maiga and my co-host Jumana. I also would like to express a special thanks to Undina Schaefer, who has been interpreting in international sign. I would like to thank all the Documenta 15 team, and I would like to thank you all for your attention and for asking all the questions. Please note, in case you have missed some parts of this live conversation, or if you would like to share this video, it will be online very soon with subtitles also will be added. Please also save the dates for the next Lumbung Calling on August 7th, focusing on transparency. And after transparency, we'll have sufficiency and regeneration to come. Please check our website and social media channels for any other news. Thank you so much for your attention. See you soon. See you next in the Lumbung Calling.
Merci beaucoup. Baru nyala.
Tahun 2000, tahun harapan yang penuh tantangan dan mencari